Hey guys, good morning. This is Coach Barryline. We're going to be talking a little bit more in depth about some of the reform movements that we mentioned in the last video. We're going to talk about the women's movement specifically and, of course, the abolition movement, both of which really pick up steam during the antebellum period. So first we're going to talk about the women's movement because there's a lot of crossover really between the women's movement and the abolition movement. So we'll start out talking about the women's movement and then we'll get into abolition. So for the most part, women during this period lived under pretty strict social and legal conditions. For instance, women couldn't vote or hold public office for the most part. Other than marriage contracts, they couldn't enter into legal contracts. And when married couples were divorced, the law gave custody, usually gave custody to the children of the father. So it's very different than, for instance, what we see today. Also, women couldn't own property. With very few exceptions. Now they could inherit property from their husband if they didn't have children, but for the most part, women could not own their own property. And despite this fact, women were very important to the American economy, specifically to the labor force. I mean, more than 60,000 industrial workers were women, and for the most part, their wages were low. Anything they made actually legally belonged to their husbands, and they were expected to turn over their entire earnings to their families. Oftentimes their wages were low because factory workers assumed that women would have husbands or fathers to help care for them, so they didn't feel like they needed to pay them good wages. All right, so socially there were some widely held views about women, such as women being inferior to men, that women should attend to the household and family duties and to their husbands. It's called the cult of domesticity, this idea that a woman's proper place was in the home. And that matters of business and government and politics should be handled by men. And this became a widespread belief during the Industrial Revolution. And of course, this is a product of the Industrial Revolution, because before the Industrial Revolution, on the frontiers and on the farm, women have to work alongside the men. It's only after the division of labor that occurs during the Industrial Revolution that really this idea of the cult of domesticity rises up. They believed that family life was threatened by taking women out of the house. So not only should women not work, but that women leaving the home to work would lead to a threat to American society. And so the cult of domesticity developed, and this basically said that women should remain in the home. Books, magazines, newspapers all praised the virtues of women staying at home, caring for their families, obeying their husbands. And this is an outgrowth of the idea of Republican motherhood that develops during the American Revolution. Women still are active, though, in social matters. Women form church societies that extend from their church works, and many of these church societies evolve into reform movements. And these reform movements are going to address a number of issues. The New York Female Reform Society, for example, was formed in 1834 and existed to try to promote moral behavior. Many groups, smaller groups, pop up throughout the nation. So society members would visit the poor, poorhouses, jails, other kinds of places to provide religious instruction and encouragement. Again, this idea that we talked about of Republican motherhood as the woman being the protector of moral good and decency and things of that nature. Others often establish women's homes or girls' homes for those in need. So you start to see this more active push. Many also lead the movement to reform education. Catherine Beecher ran a school for women called the Hartford Female Seminary, and she later opened the Western Female Institute in Cincinnati. Beecher wanted to create normal schools that sent teachers to the West to educate frontier children. So this is going to become the beginning of the idea that women will be educators, teachers. Oberlin College in Ohio becomes the first American college that became co-ed in 1833. 1837, Mary Lyon established Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts, and this was the first women's college in the United States. Many of these women became teachers during this era, and of course it gave them a very important role in shaping American life. Urban reforms that begin early in the Reform era are dominated by these female reform societies that we talked about a second ago. Women also are on the front lines of the labor movement. Some of the earliest strikes were led by women who were trying to improve their working conditions. And of course, the temperance movement, which we'll talk about a little bit more in detail later. The temperance movement was dominated by women. Women were more economically dependent on men, and were more often, they and their children were victims of excessive alcohol consumption, whether it be poverty or domestic violence or other types of issues that arose from alcoholism. So women a lot of times were on the front lines of that fight. All right, so the first Women's Rights Convention was held in Seneca Falls, New York. And it actually wasn't just a women's rights convention. It was actually talked about abolition and a range of other issues, but women's rights becomes why it's famous, because many historians mark it as the beginning of the American women's movement. Many women wanted to obtain political power in order to advance their reforms, and other women thought the political power should be available to women just because it was fair and reasonable. So you had different reasons for wanting the vote, but lots of people. The Seneca Falls Convention really puts forward this idea of political equality. So the two main organizers, of course, are Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. And Mott was a prominent abolitionist, so you have lots of crossover. In fact, the women's rights movement grew out of the fact that men in the abolition movement often refused to pay attention or give rights to speak to women in the abolitionist movement. Stanton, much like Mott, was an abolitionist, and they were both motivated by their experiences of demonstration. They went to the World Anti-Slavery Convention in London in 1840, and women were not allowed to speak at the platform. So they were both motivated by that experience. So Stanton and Mott called the convention on behalf of women's rights, 1848, and it was attended by about 300 people, and produced a document called the Declaration of Sentiments, based heavily on the Declaration of Rights. It was written by Stanton, and it was signed by 100 participants, 68 of whom were women and 32 of whom were men. And it publicly stated the belief that all men and women are created equal. So it really takes Jefferson's words and incorporates them into the Declaration of Sentiment. Of course, the suffrage movement is not the only place. Suffrage movement, temperance movement is not the only place we see women. Really, a lot of these grow out of the organization during abolition. And of course, slavery had been an American institution for 200 years by this time. Every colony throughout the North and the South, or every state throughout the North and the South, held slaves early on in U.S. history. But as after the Revolution, northern states began to phase out slavery, although it exists in some form or another in the North until the 1840s. And by 1860, nearly 4 million African Americans live in slavery in the South. Most people work every day of their lives. Sometimes they might have Sundays off, depending on their slaveholder. From the time they're old enough to perform chores until they're too old to be of any more use. Most people lived on farms or plantations that grew cotton, although rice and tobacco were big products too, and sugar cane as well. They worked planting, tending, picking, processing, loading cotton, all those types of things that go along with it. Other things, they might do other tasks such as construction or repairs, servants in the households, any number of duties slaves might be expected to do. Some were skilled artisans, blacksmiths, bricklayers, carpenters, and even some were able to make money on the side using their talents and to buy their freedom. Some lived in cities where they worked in factories and mills and places like that, and others in mines or as lumberjacks in forests. So slaves did a number of jobs and really built the United States in a lot of ways. However, enslaved African Americans were often provided inadequate food, clothing, shelter, very rarely received medical care, and sickness was not an excuse to not work. And generally were not protected under the law any more than a farm animal would be, a beast of burden. So many slaveholders treated their slaves relatively well, but it wasn't because they believed that the slaves were human beings. It's just because they didn't want them to run away. Many used a wide variety of punishments: beating, whipping, starving, threatening to sell family members down the river, all those kinds of things to keep slaves doing what they wanted them to do. Children were often separated from their parents. Families were split up on a routine basis. Brothers and sisters, husbands and wives, families were decimated by the institution of slavery. African Americans, as they had from the beginning of the African slave trade, developed ways to survive and bring some light into their lives through religion, storytelling, and music. And these really became ways of resisting against the institution of slavery. So in 1860, you did have about 215,000 blacks in the South that were free. Many of these were former slaves who'd been emancipated by their slaveholders. Generally, they were free because their ancestors had been freed. Still, most faced harsh legal, social discrimination, and free blacks often helped those trying to escape slavery. You had a number of slavery revolts, small-scale slavery revolts throughout the South during this time. The most famous of which is Nat Turner's revolt in 1830 that killed dozens of whites throughout Virginia during this time, and governments reacted very harshly obviously to this and started passing all sorts of strict limits on the movements and meetings of slaves, because Turner had been a preacher and he moved amongst plantations, so those kind of movements are going to be severely restricted moving forward. Most people that end their enslavement do so through escape, and they try to reach free states of the North or Canada or Mexico where slavery was illegal. There's no way to measure how many actually escaped, but we know thousands attempted escape for certain. And most were soon captured. Many did make it to freedom. And what developed is the Underground Railroad, which was an informal network of escape routes. Sympathetic white people and free blacks often provided escapees with food, hiding places, direction to their next destination, and kind of tried to speed them along to the next destination closer to free territory. Of course, in Kentucky, we're one of the main highways of the Underground Railroad because of our location right across the river from free territories. Of course, the most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad is Harriet Tubman. She escaped slavery from Maryland on her own, and she actually went back on dozens of trips to help other slaves. I think by the time she was done, there was over 300 people that she helped personally lead to slavery or to freedom. Meanwhile, free blacks and whites start to fight against slavery, and this movement was called Abolition. It had a lot of attention, a lot of followers, and probably had as much impact as any other social reform movement in American history. It had deep religious roots. Many religious people saw slavery as morally wrong, and by 1836, more than 500 anti-slavery societies existed. The most famous leader was William Lloyd Garrison. He published an abolitionist newspaper for 35 years. Sarah and Angelina Grimke were sisters who were outspoken campaigners for abolition. And of course, Frederick Douglass, former slave and eloquent speaker and author, he supported women's rights also, but he argued for abolition, of course. And Southern slaveholders saw this as an attack on their livelihood and way of life, and even on their religion. So arguing that slavery was essential to the economy, This was an economic issue as well. So Northern workers also believed that freedom for slaves might be more